Hi guys, today it's Shad again. So today we're going to be taking you through moving workloads into Azure. So one of the things that I want to cover first is why migrate to the cloud? It's a good question. I think as we all know, the cloud, it's not going away. When it first came about, we were all sitting there going, well, it's just hosted up in somebody else's in another data center. And I think as we've seen as the years have been by, most CTOs and CIOs, they're being pressured to get out of their data centers and to start using the cloud. The cloud at first, it was kind of just rehosting and doing it in somebody else's. But I think as time has went on, there's all kinds of services that are out there now that make it easier to take advantage of the cloud with platform as a service, of course, reducing the apps, reducing deployment time. But just a few initiatives that we're seeing right now is most CTOs and CIOs are looking for ways to optimize their existing cloud use or moving more workloads into the cloud. We get all kinds of calls on how can we get these moved up? How do I get this out of my data center? How do I get this processing that happens nightly off of these servers? And when's a good time to go? That's a good question. So some triggers that would allow you to go through a cloud migration exercise, it's pretty self-explanatory. We're living in an age of breathtaking transformation that's going on right now. And as the cloud progresses, the world is doing more business out there in the cloud. I think all the change agents are pretty self-explanatory, but just going through, if you've got contracts that are expiring out in your data center, of course, don't sign up for those again. Go out to the cloud. If you've got acquisitions going on, it's a good time to start thinking about moving that workload out into the cloud. Or if you've got capacity needs, I don't know how many times I've heard Christmas season's coming up and we always get slammed and we have tons of orders. Well, we've worked with tons of customers that have moved their workloads over into the cloud, and that way you've got auto scaling, auto build out of servers, and the capacity and demand can fluctuate up and down automatically. You don't have to do anything for it. Just set up the rules and then it kind of runs itself. But software, hardware refreshes, any kind of security threats, we'll get into some of why Azure is the best in a security standpoint here in a minute. Compliance standpoints, from an application and innovation standpoint, you can deliver faster if you're just throwing it out there. You don't have to wait on IT to spin up your environment anymore. And of course, software and end-of-life support. So there are 4 areas that Azure goes across, and it's through a productive, hybrid, intelligent, and trusted. And it's these 4 pillars that's the main value. In each one of these pillars, as we take a look at them, if you look at the productive side of it, you've already got all your integrated tooling that's inside of Visual Studio. So any third-party apps are already out there. There's Azure DevOps that's out there too. But there's hundreds of services that are out there that are built into Azure that can help you move your workloads in these applications, databases, infrastructure up into the cloud. You've got Kubernetes out there from a container standpoint, all kinds of logic apps that are out there to use, look at pictures, do AI, any kind of cognitive, all of that is sitting out there. And from the management standpoint, you've got a single cloud and your policy and governance goes across all of them. So just looking at the portal, from a policy management standpoint, you've got your cost management that's out there, configuration, you can do updating and scripting. All of this can be scripted out. Monitoring from an IT standpoint, that feeds back into all your logs that they're currently doing today. And protection, automatic backups, automatic disaster recovery once you have it set up too. It's just a flick of a switch. And think about how many times you've had to set up a data center to have a DR at another location. With the cloud, it's just you set it up in a different region and it's out there. And when one goes down, the other one picks back up. And like I said before, very, very secure. From a hybrid standpoint, everything that you're doing today, Active Directory wise, is supported up there. There's an Azure Active Directory that's out there that reads from your Active Directory, and then you can also switch over to the Azure Active Directory as you get going. There is an appliance that's out there called Azure Stack, where you can bring that in-house and use that as kind of a stair step into Azure. So it's kind of like your private cloud, but you can take advantage of Azure as you need to if you're not just, both feet in at the same time. From a SQL Server standpoint, everything that you've done out there in SQL Server is normally migratable. You can use SSIS packages out there with Azure Data Services. And then there's, as you upgrade databases out there too, you can run through the database assistant to get them out into Azure that kind of tells you what you need to do from a database standpoint. Sometimes there's little things with keys and things like that in indexes, but things that you can certainly work through. Then from a security standpoint, of course, security and management, it's basically the same on both sides. From an intelligence standpoint, there are all kinds of language APIs, machine learning, bot services that you can subscribe to, the Vision API, which is what I was talking about earlier with the pictures. You've got Azure SQL DBAs out there, DBs, and then machine learning that you can tap into. From a security standpoint, you've got more certifications than you can possibly imagine. This is just some of them that are out there, but it carries every ISO, every SOC, every HIPAA, all of the nice high trust, anything that you could ever need out here. Regionally, in each one, I know that there are a lot of businesses that do in other countries. They have to have their own regional certifications that are out there too. It carries the most out of any cloud provider that's out there. You've also got global coverage with this too. So this is what I was talking about with the regions. There are 60 Azure regions now in over 140 countries. So that's pretty big. And when you're talking about having your workloads be where they need to be, we just worked with a customer that they were working down in Mexico. We were doing business here in St. Louis, needed to do stuff in Mexico, but also push stuff to Singapore in the morning. Well, they've got different Azure regions that they're pushing that to. So it makes it tons faster. They're not talking back to the region in the United States. Those workloads are actually being done in the region that they're at, and they get their data tons faster. They used to have to pull those files down and it go across the internet, and it could take, an hour or so to pull down some of these files. Now they're almost instantaneous. From an Azure Security Center standpoint, like I said, it has all of your best practices in there. Once you get set up out in Azure, it detects all your threats and attacks, and it gives you kind of a dashboard from an IT perspective to be able to remediate any of those issues. It's constantly monitoring your environment. So I think at this point, we wanted to talk a little bit about giving an overview of how you move some of your workloads into Azure, and one of the toolings that you would use would be the Azure Migrate tools that are out there. So I think at this point, I'm going to turn the conversation over to Mark and have him talk to it. Mark, welcome.
Thank you, Shad. Let me go ahead and pull up here. Hold on. All right, here we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and kind of do an overview of the Azure Migrate tool and some of the things that that brings to the table for companies looking to migrate to Azure. So for the Azure Migration Center, we understand how challenging and intimidating it can be to transition your business critical investments to the cloud. Our goal is to ensure that you feel confident when migrating, knowing your options, and ultimately set up your business for low friction Azure adoption. To that end, we're making some key investments. The Azure Migration Center provides how-to guidance and technical resources customized by customer scenario and workloads. The Azure also provides rich choice of first-party and third-party assessments and migration tools to help customers meet a variety of different workload migration requirements. The Fast Track for Azure provides direct assistance from Azure engineers working together with partners to help customers deploy Azure solutions quickly and confidently. Azure also has a highly skilled ecosystem that can help customers plan and execute cloud migration initiatives and manage their Azure environments on an ongoing basis. Azure also helps customers keep themselves up to date on their cloud skills with a wealth of learning resources ranging from self-paced online courses, hands-on experiences, and certifications. So on your journey to the Azure migration, you can join thousands of customers who are migrating to Azure by using a proven methodology, Microsoft and partner tools, and a large ecosystem of partners to help during the move. Over the years, Microsoft has continued to evolve their migration tools. Today, it's referred to as Azure Migrate, and that's more of a central hub for Azure services. And it helps simplify your cloud migration. And there's 3 bullet points that you can really look at for that migration effort. The assess is where you start your migration by discovering and assessing your on-premise apps, data, and infrastructure. You're going to use tools like Azure Migrate and Movere to inventory your entire fleet, servers, databases, and applications. And this is going to help you in the decision-making on what to target. You start with the least complex workflows to demonstrate quick wins, and resources that are capacity constrained, reaching end of support, or need hardware refresh, or those that are cloud ready are all great candidates. When you're done with the initial assessment, the next step is going to be your migration. And that's where you're going to move your apps, data, and infrastructure confidently using powerful free tools that guide you through and automate the cloud migration journey while minimizing downtime. And then finally, once you have everything migrated, the next step and the final step is going to be where you're looking to optimize everything that you have. In Azure, you can streamline your cloud resources continuously, which is going to enhance your security and improve performance and maximize your return on investment with free cost management tools. So when you're ready to do that migration, Microsoft offers the Azure Migrate up in the portal, where once you log in, you're going to find 2 different locations that you can easily get to it. You have the search bar at the top where you can type in Azure Migrate. And then on the bottom of that, you can also find links where you'll find the Azure migration tools. Once you start that effort, it's going to drive you to the next option where you can have multiple scenarios to consider. And this is where you can use a comprehensive approach to migrating your applications and data center estate. You can get support for key migration workloads like Windows and Linux servers. You can also get support for SQL and other databases. And you can also finally explore other scenarios such as moving data, web apps, and virtual desktops that might exist in your organization. Migrating to destinations include Azure Virtual Machines, VMware Solution, App Services, and Azure SQL Databases. Migrations are holistic across VMware, Hyper-V, physical servers, and cloud-to-cloud migrations. So in the event that you have VMs that you want to migrate, this basically is going to fall under the path of servers. And I can kind of walk you through a little bit of how that works in the Migrate tool. So when you first start out that effort, what you're going to first do is you're going to define your resource group, where this allows you to kind of partition up different items that might exist in your organization, which will later allow you to do cost analysis on different departments and different teams that might exist that you want to get a better analysis of. Once you define your resource groups, then you're going to define your project, and then you're going to target the geography where your data centers live today. So on the next step going forward, after you've defined all that, the first step is doing the assessment. And basically doing the assessment, you're going to have what's called an appliance tool, where it allows you to go ahead and install that on whatever machines that you need to do the assessment with. And then for the VMs, we cover everything from Hyper-V to physical and other sources, as well as the VMware using the hypervisor. So in this step, in the wizard that you get driven through, we're going to name the appliance. And once you name the appliance, you're going to generate a key. And the key is used to match the results of the assessment that are later used in the migration phase. So once you get to the next stage, you have two options for doing the assessment. You have a virtual machine that's been prepackaged that you can run on your systems, or you can actually download a zip file that contains the application. And then once you set that up initially, it's going to go through a list of checks to make sure that everything's ready for uploading data over to Azure. And that appliance is actually made up of a list of different components. So the different components allow you to drive the different steps in the system. You have agents, which are going to gather information on your machines. And then you also have the agents that are actually going to do the replication. And then you have the gateways that are going to migrate all that data up to Azure. And then because of all the evolving changes, those services are going to be updating every 24 hours to keep up with the latest changes that might be out there in the marketplace. So when you're looking at databases, you have on-premise databases that you might be looking to move out to Azure. And so this is another step that is covered in the migration efforts. And again, just like the server, it's going to lead you through a series of steps to execute, where you're going to download the assessment tool that you're going to install on the machines that you're going to want to migrate. And then it allows you to target different instances of databases up in Azure, whether you're going to want to migrate over to an Azure database, managed instance, whether you're going to host them up on Azure for virtual services or dedicated servers themselves. And then part of the setup process is defining the servers, where you're going to go in and you're going to key in all the configuration for your systems. Once you key all that stuff in, it's going to provide you a list of different databases that's available for migration. Once you've identified those, it's going to give you a summary of the different databases, different server versions, and the size of each database. Kind of gives you an overview of what you're going to migrate. And then once you've done that, you're going to start the assessment. It's going to go through and it's going to look for any challenges that might exist, or it's going to let you know which ones are going to be ready to migrate over to Azure at 100% capacity. And so I think on the next step, Paul, do you want to take over from here?
Yeah, let me go ahead and jump in.
Okay.
So I just have one slide here to go over on the container, so I'll share my screen out. All right, good afternoon. Is that streaming across? Is that coming across, Mark, or? Okay, just want to make sure, can anybody hear me?
It is, but it's still in PowerPoint. You might want to go into presentation mode.
Thank you.
There you go.
All right. Good morning. So I just want to quickly kind of go over containers. I think when a lot of companies are looking to migrate to the cloud, they're looking at the need, kind of the use case for containerization, Docker, whether they're going to bring in Kubernetes, whether they should be using Service Fabric in Azure. So these are kind of a lot of common questions that we get when helping customers migrate to the cloud. So there's two primary use cases out there that typically come up when looking at containers. One is we have some legacy the customer may have some legacy applications out there where they have dependencies on the OS. So maybe they've got SQLite, so they've got some DLLs in the GAC. Maybe they have some third-party dependencies out there, such as some PDF drivers installed on those OSs. And they want to not necessarily just lift into a IaaS model onto a virtual machine, but they want to move and start taking advantage of some of the PaaS offerings out there, such as Azure App Services. So it's kind of one of the kind of prime use cases out there for containerization is getting legacy applications up into PaaS without having to go through a costly refactor or rewrite of the application. So it's a big piece of that. We can use the ACR. So on the local machine, you can use Docker to create your Docker file, create an image of your application, which includes the OS and all those dependencies. At that point, you can push that up to an Azure Container Registry. So in the mix there, you could actually have Azure Kubernetes services as well that will serve up those images and deploy those out to your PaaS services. So that's one common use case for that we work on customers. But a lot of times that question is kind of what are the trade-offs? We got to ramp up our development team on learning the Docker, learning Kubernetes. So that is kind of that trade-off there is there's a little bit of that ramp up and overhead and kind of learning those technologies. And we can assist our customers with that as well. But the big piece there is bringing in those legacy applications. Of course, the other option for that is microservices. So maybe they have microservices on-prem and they're going to move those microservices to the cloud. Or maybe that's going to be a completely refactor or a rewrite of the application as they move into the cloud. So they're not just going to lift it. So that is kind of the big use case out there on the containers. And there's also a misconception a lot out there on containers that to go to PaaS services that containers are a requirement to move to PaaS. So if you got a web application on premise, you're not required to put that into a container to move to PaaS. Application services in Azure and web apps out there can be hosted in PaaS without, you can just push your .NET framework code up there, your .NET Core application up there, and host that without having to put that inside of a container. So those considerations for containers are typically more around legacy applications or moving to microservices. And it's kind of people look at breaking down those monoliths. A big piece behind that is not just necessarily because they need that scalability. You can actually, that's kind of another misconception that goes out there that we need containers to scale. So within Azure and App Services, when you migrate these, you can scale out horizontally without going to containers. So on a premium app service in Azure, you can scale out up to 100 times horizontally without going into containers. So the big use case out there for that is typically breaking down the, looking at the microservices. It's not just about scalability, but it's about breaking down that monolith into smaller domain concepts, so we can actually make code changes to services and push those out there without introducing fragility in our kind of monolithic architecture where we make one change that breaks everything. So I'm going to kick it back then, because that's all I had on the containers, and I got another piece here in a few minutes.
All right. Well, thank you, Paul. I appreciate that. I think now let's get into, so doing it in the Azure Migrate tool allows you to move your own workloads into Azure, and it gives you all the tooling. I think from a process standpoint, what I think it lacks the maturity of actually moving loads into Azure. And so us as Oakwood, of course, being the consultants that we are, we've been doing this for quite some time. And so what we bring to the table is kind of a four-phased approach to going out to Azure. And it's where we take a look at the environment that you have out there, and we go through and we do a readiness assessment on your environment. And that goes through all of the networking, all of the servers, just trying to take a look at what you have out there. And then after that, setting up a foundation that you can move into Azure. So then looking at all your apps that you have out there, migrate and modernizing those, and then optimizing and managing on the back end. So the problems that you're trying to address as you're moving your data centers over into a cloud is all of these different things. It's people, process, and technology. So think about how many times that you've had PMs that were out there, technical staff, political agendas, things like that, that people were trying to do, or conflict resolution. Everybody wants to do something their way. And I think from a process standpoint, we've seen a big shift to DevOps. It's certainly working, I'll give you that. But from a compliance and governance and security standpoint, there are huge gaps that are in certain organizations. But certainly from a process standpoint, people are trying to align how to do this better. And I think from a technology standpoint, and you look at all the different technology that we have inside of organizations, moving these technologies into the cloud, it really only makes sense because it aligns the people, the process, and the technology as you go along. Anytime that we're talking about modernizing anything, it's not just one for one. I don't know how many times I've been in conversations with people where when they said, oh, well, we're gonna move this, we're gonna shift this, so trying to get down to what that actually means is very important with customers. Most are just gonna do a lift and shift where they're gonna rehost that out there and take what's out there and put it out in the cloud as an infrastructure as a service model and use VMs that are out there. Others, they're talking about wanting to re-architect or rebuild those or refactor and take advantage of some of the offerings that are out in the cloud. Sometimes they're just going to replace it. There's a SaaS model that's out there that's going to be used for some other company, and they're going to do something with it. So when you're talking about modernizing different applications in your cloud environment or infrastructure environment, it's important to kind of break down what you're going to do with that in it, because it's not one of the same. So first phase that we go through, of course, is a readiness assessment. And as Mark and Paul kind of talked through before, we like to go through and do an inventory of your physical and virtual software servers that you have out there and all the storage just to determine if it's even ready for Azure. Inside of doing this, we use another program called Movere. It's a little bit different than the Azure Migrate tool that's out there, but it is also owned by Microsoft. And Microsoft will usually pony up some money for this if they can look at the workload that you have out there and say, oh, we're going to get them over onto Azure, so we'll put some money up for it. They usually will pay for this type of assessment. So if you're really thinking about going to the cloud, let us know, and we can usually get some money out there for it. But what it does is it goes through and it looks and it determines sizing-wise how you're going to actually use the Azure environment from a consumption standpoint. It gives a lot of detailed costing information for what you're going to use out there from a storage, from a compute standpoint, and then we also have some application dependency that it outputs so that we can see this application is dependent on that one. It kind of gives you kind of a roadmap on what to move as you're moving through. Along the same side of that, we'll be going through and doing an app portfolio discovery as that's running through. So if you're looking at the environment, we also have to look at the apps that are running on those. So we as Oakwood go through and do some stakeholder interviews across your organization and look at work streams and try to find and make sure that we know how these are being used. Alongside of that too, we're looking at DevOps that are being used out there and trying to make sure that we are moving these as we need to. So lots of Workstream whiteboarding, trying to make sure that we know applications are being used and what's being touched on the inside of it. And then what we do is we take that back and we say, wow, so from an Azure standpoint, what are we going to move this into? And which services are we going to use that are going to do this application, or what can it use? And lay all those cards on the table and basically help you understand from an Azure moving into the cloud standpoint, what makes more sense, because there are a lot of different ways to do something. So we'll usually have a grid that kind of looks like this that basically says for this app or set of apps, these would be your best recommended source for moving this workload into the cloud. Of course, if you have some batch jobs that are out there, you know, there's Azure Batch that runs them. Or if it's a service-oriented architecture, you may use some services out there. You may actually just use Azure Functions and be able to call straight into those and have background tasks call into them. So just depending on the workload, we help try to align which services out in Azure that you should actually use, and then tell you why you should use one over the other, because there are cost differences between using one as opposed to another. Same thing for modernizing your database. So as we move from on-prem to in the cloud, you can use the tooling that's out there in Azure Migrate. It actually goes pretty fast if you're just wanting to move a database up there. But if you're talking about doing some built-in high availability, you're scaling everything that's out there, it's usually best to kind of check with a consultant and see how best to do some of those things. So after we run through the assessment, what we basically set up a foundation for you. So this is going through and from the resource tagging kind of that Mark talked about, and making sure that we have the right resource groups out there. We set up all the security and the accounts that you need, get your Active Directory set up, and then go through and set up your networking. That's the biggest piece that will usually hang up people, is getting the networking set up correctly and having a nice foundation to be able to move these loads into Azure. It's a very complex environment as you're going through. You'll see a lot of nuances out there, but once set up correctly, it becomes very powerful. After we go through that, we will run through and migrate and modernize a little bit. And Paul, you want to talk a little bit to doing the cloud asset and some of the challenges and things that you've found out there?
Absolutely, and I've got some screens to share for that. So okay, hold on here, let me try to get this set up. For some reason I'm not seeing my preview slide, so there we go. Use the shortcut key here, but I'm gonna have to scroll back. All right, well, let's going to go through the cloud ascent process. So I want to actually just kind of share out the live tool we have here. So as Shad talked about earlier, we have a program out there that Microsoft, we run in coordination with Microsoft, called Movere. So Movere will go through your entire on-premise data center, and it will gather a complete device inventory for you. So it's going to go through and get a list of all of your servers that you have out there. So we have some tooling out here that we have on top of that tool. They'll kind of go through us here. So in a single snapshot, we can see this, and we can use this for our cloud planning and assessment tool. So it really helps us with our migration, especially when you're talking about hundreds, thousands of servers. You're looking at moving up to the cloud. And you're also looking at there, you've got dependencies on these servers. So we've got an application server out here that's dependent on a SQL box, for example. We have to move one, or we're going to have a hybrid connection back to that on-premise. So this is really useful in our cloud planning. So we can come out here, we can see on this demo tenant we have out there, at a quick snapshot, we have 361 systems on-premise. that we were considering to migrate. We can come in, we can drill into that, and we can look at individual servers in that. We can break those out by our migration group. So in this example here, because we're worried about end of life and support, and we want to get our 2008 up into the cloud to extend their warranty. So we're going to prioritize those first. So those are our P1 groups. So we can really drill into that. And this really helps us with our right sizing as we migrate to the cloud. So maybe we have something over provisioned on premise today. Where it's got, we're looking at the average CPU and RAM out here. We're like, whoa, we got, 128 gigs of RAM, but we never use more than 48 of that or something. So we can really come out here and use this to help with right sizing as well, to save money as this moves into the cloud. Another kind of key piece of this that Chad talked about earlier with this tool is the dependency mappings. So we can come out here and drill into a particular server, and we can see all the other servers that are dependent on. So this really helps us with our planning and migration as we move up into the cloud. We also have out here just on the PaaS side, so we want to move up to application services. We got some cost comparisons out here, so we can see just on the raw cost, not necessarily total cost of ownership, but just raw host. We can see, okay, if we go to a app service, it's going to cost us $146 a month. If we set up an availability set with some redundancy out there, it's going to cost us $183 a month. So we can see that cost savings out here. So we can also plan from a budgetary and kind of fiscal as we move to the cloud on, what kind of cost savings we might see out of IaaS versus PaaS. So this is a really useful tool for helping kind of migrate an entire data center or even a piece of a data center. So maybe it's not 100% move to the cloud, maybe it's 25%, but really kind of help us go through and coordinate that migration up into the cloud. We also have on the back side of that, once it's up in the cloud, we have another tool here. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this today, but this one will actually help you once everything's up in the cloud. I think the big benefit of this Cloud Ascent tool is if you have multiple tenants in Azure, this will actually report across all of your tenants. So you got some aggregate dashboards out here where you're getting the security advisor recommendations out of Azure. You can get some information on cost savings out of Azure as well. So this is a really useful tool for kind of getting a snapshot of that across all of your Azure tenants. And I'm going to kick it back to you, Shad.
Cool, thanks. All righty, thank you, Paul. All right, well, the last item of our process is to optimize and manage that environment that we've stood up. So after the migration part happens and you move your workloads over there, you're going to want to take a look and make sure that you've got all the pieces in place to make sure that it's secure, of course, well managed, and then the most cost efficient that you can have after your move. So out there, we're looking at the governing, making sure that all the policies and the cost management is put in place, that from a security standpoint, everything that you need to have is turned on, and from a security management standpoint, it's all configured correctly. From a configuration standpoint, anything that developers do to environments should all be scripted. So having a nice DevOps practice in place to be able to manage those and have it go through some kind of scrutiny process of taking a look at what's happening. It doesn't mean that you have to slow them down so much, but there needs to be some kind of governance in place there to be able to have that, but also have it automatically scripted whenever it needs to be. And from a protection standpoint, just making sure that you've got all your backups and your disaster recovery, and then that you can monitor that. But that is the process that Oakwood takes to take our customers through moving to the cloud. So whether you're going to go it alone and use the Azure Migrate tools that are out there, they work for smaller workloads, and that's great. But if you're actually taking a look at moving these over into the cloud, I think our method of going up there and getting you there with our four-phased approach, it's worked for a lot of companies. So that is pretty much what we have for our webinar today. I know that we had a few questions that came in, so I will open it up for Q&A. I think Tim is going to be fielding some of these. So Tim, did we have any anything that came in?
Yeah, we do. And as we get started here, feel free to post those again in the Q&A section, what should be found in the right side of your window there of the Teams meeting. Every Microsoft consultant, we get the question all the time, AWS or Azure?
Yeah, we do get that all the time. Just to talk a little bit about Azure versus AWS. You know, they're comparable to each other, and it's almost like an Apple versus an Android phone type of conversation. You know, some people like Apple, some people like Android better, and you know, you got that faction of people. I will certainly attest to that Azure is cheaper. So if you go and you do cost studies out between AWS and Azure, you will find that you are going to pay less with Azure. It is 5 times more expensive to use AWS than it is for Azure, and just from a licensing standpoint alone, that's where it usually falls down. I think from a integration standpoint, Microsoft really has outdone themselves again with being able to have it integrated into the developer tools. So everything that I'm doing out there is already at my fingertips. I can deploy straight from Visual Studio out into Azure. I can move workloads very easily out into Azure. I can spin up environments and everything. So from a Fortune 500 standpoint too, Azure carries 95% of all Fortune 500 companies that are out there. They've got more than 30 plus years in there as using Azure. They were using Azure way before Azure was offered out as a service. But there are 68,000 partners that are out there that are integrated into Azure and provide services out to Azure, which is something that Amazon and AWS, they cannot even tout that they have that many partners that are out there. I think from a certification standpoint, there are 90 plus certifications that are out there as well. And so it's the most trusted cloud. I'm sure that you guys saw the news and everything, and I don't know if it was Trump hating on Amazon or whatever with Jeff Bezos, but you know, the government even chose Microsoft Azure over AWS, and just from a security standpoint. Very, very secure platform, and of course they're going to have their own out there, and you know, so anyway, I think those are the most compelling reasons that I could think of why you would want to choose one over the other. I do see a lot of companies using both, so just because you know, you would choose one doesn't mean that you can't piddle around with it too and see if it can do something else. But I think if I was using and moving a company over into it, of course we are a Microsoft Gold partner and we're going to pick Microsoft, but that's why we chose to align ourselves with Microsoft too. It just has the better tooling, I guess.
Good, thanks, Chad.
Yep.
I got another question. I'm going to try to blend a couple together, kind of understanding the sentiment here. We have someone on the call, multiple billion-dollar financial services, several thousand employees, and he's asking, are there firms, is this something Oakwood can do in terms of auditing their environment? How can they prove that their Azure footprint is as secure as their on-premise footprint? You know, how do they back and talk through the security of Azure?
Sure. Well, certainly we can. So running through an assessment from a security standpoint is certainly something that we can do. We would, of course, run it on-prem first, and then we have the tooling to be able to go through and take a look at the cloud footprint as well. Running through these security audits is something that we're normally accustomed to, because that's what we're trying to do, is help set up your governance for your environment. And so something that we've certainly done. I think a normal assessment like that, depending on how big, I don't know how many servers that we're talking about, but we can certainly have a discussion about it. So yes.
Good. Another question here. How do we segment a whole migration into smaller sub-projects to reduce risk? Example, live environment versus non-production, critical versus non-critical,
yeah,
etc.
I think I see that a lot whenever we're doing migrations, is you don't want to do it all at once. So it's best to take a look at where you're coming from and try to set up that foundation first. So getting the Azure Foundation set, all the security around what you're going to need for that, and then working in chunks. I'm a big fan of doing things in an agile function and having phases to projects. So I would identify and take a look at it probably one of two ways. You've got low-hanging fruit out there that you know that would be really easy. Let's say if it was end of life for some older software, moving those over into Azure, you can extend the life of that. So those are easy wins right there of moving it into newer technology. Or if you're looking for a bigger splash, taking some of the harder to do ones and putting that out there first, just to show that, hey, look, we did this bigger one, so the smaller ones are going to be a piece of cake now.
Right.
But I would say splitting them into smaller chunks is easier, and then coming up with a roadmap on moving it across. Normally, we've worked with a few larger companies where their roadmap to get into Azure, this isn't like we're talking a month or two. There's a 3-year roadmap that's there to move directly into it. There's a lot of moving pieces when you're talking about applications in a business, and you cannot disrupt what's going on today with what they're doing. So there's got to be a plan to be able to go through that. But that's what we help customers with, is coming up with that plan and getting them moved over.